thunderous crack of Shaolin fists shattering stone, the whispered hiss of Wudang swords cutting through silk, the terrifying chant of forbidden rituals echoing from hidden temples where death cults plotted the overthrow of dynasties. This is not some martial arts fantasy. This is the brutal reality of the three-way war that secretly controlled Chinese civilization for over 1,000 years. A struggle between state-sanctioned warriors, mystical mountain hermits, and revolutionary death cults that determined which emperors lived and which dynasties fell. We have all heard stories of ancient martial arts, but what this triangle of power reveals is something else entirely. The question wasn't who had the best fighting techniques. The question was who could weaponize ideology effectively enough to control the most powerful empire on Earth. You think political power comes from armies and bureaucrats? In Imperial China, it came from three forces that most people have never heard of. Forces so dangerous that emperors spent fortunes trying to control them and centuries trying to destroy them. This wasn't just about martial arts schools. This was systematic ideological warfare where Buddhist monks, Taoist hermits, and revolutionary cultists fought a shadow war that determined the fate of dynasties and the survival of civilizations. Today, we're diving into the brutal truth of who really ruled Imperial China. Not the emperors on their thrones, but the three powers that could make or break imperial authority through the systematic application of violence, mysticism, and revolutionary terror. This is the story of the triangle of power that controlled the Dragon Throne. But here's what most people don't realize about Shaolin Temple. They weren't peaceful monks practicing martial arts for spiritual enlightenment. They became the emperor's unofficial strike force, a militarized religious order that could field thousands of warrior monks trained in combat techniques that made them more effective than professional soldiers. Picture the systematic militarization. Shaolin monks who could march in formation, fight with coordinated tactics, and deploy weapons ranging from staffs to swords with military precision. This wasn't meditation. This was weaponized Buddhism designed to serve imperial power. But here's where it gets insane. Shaolin's loyalty to the throne wasn't spiritual, it was transactional. The monastery received imperial patronage, tax exemptions, and legal protection in exchange for providing military service whenever the emperor needed religious warriors to handle problems that regular armies couldn't solve. Archaeological evidence reveals Shaolin training grounds designed like military barracks, weapons caches that could equip small armies, and fortifications that turned the monastery into a fortress capable of withstanding siege warfare. The real genius was in the external martial philosophy, Waijia, that emphasized direct confrontation, overwhelming force, and the systematic destruction of enemies through superior physical conditioning and aggressive tactics. Chinese historical records describe Shaolin monks as the iron fist of imperial authority, recognition that they had become the emperor's solution for problems that required both religious legitimacy and devastating violence. But here's what's truly terrifying about Shaolin's power. They could operate with religious immunity while conducting military operations. Enemies who fought back against monks were committing sacrilege, while the monks themselves were performing religious duty. The sound was like thunder rolling across battlefields. The systematic application of overwhelming force by warriors who believed that serving the emperor was serving Buddha himself. Their external arts created fighters who could break bones with bare hands, shatter weapons with wooden staffs, and maintain combat effectiveness even when outnumbered by conventional forces. Get this. While Shaolin provided the emperor's muscle, Wudang Mountain supplied something even more valuable: divine legitimacy. The Taoist masters weren't just martial artists. They were the spiritual architects of imperial authority who could make or break the mandate of heaven itself. Imagine the systematic influence. Wudang Taoists, who served as imperial advisors, court astronomers, and ritual specialists whose approval could legitimize new dynasties or condemn existing ones as spiritually corrupt. Picture the moment of ultimate validation. The Ming Yongle Emperor claiming that Zhenwu, the Taoist deity of Wudang Mountain, had personally aided his usurpation of the throne. This wasn't just political propaganda, it was theological warfare that transformed rebellion into divine mandate. But here's where it gets insane. Wudang's power wasn't based on armies or wealth. It was based on internal martial philosophy, nei jia, that demonstrated spiritual superiority through techniques that appeared to defy physical laws. Archaeological evidence from Wudang reveals training facilities designed for circular movements, meditation chambers for energy cultivation, and architectural layouts that embodied Taoist principles of harmony and flow. The real genius was in the soft power approach. While Shaolin monks crushed enemies with direct force, Wudang masters defeated opponents by redirecting their strength, using minimal effort to achieve maximum effect, and demonstrating that spiritual cultivation was superior to physical conditioning. Legends and late imperial records describe Wudang masters who could defeat multiple armed opponents using techniques that looked effortless, proving that internal arts represented a higher level of martial and spiritual development. But here's what's truly shocking about Wudang's influence. They didn't need to threaten emperors directly. They could simply withdraw their spiritual support, leaving the dynasty without divine legitimacy and vulnerable to rebellion from forces that claimed superior heavenly mandate. The internal arts philosophy created a martial system that was also a political weapon. Proof that yielding could overcome hardness, that wisdom was superior to strength, and that true power came from understanding cosmic principles rather than accumulating physical force. The sound was like wind moving through mountains, the subtle but irresistible force of spiritual authority that could topple dynasties without ever drawing a sword. Their techniques demonstrated that the highest martial arts were indistinguishable from magic, creating an aura of supernatural power that made emperors desperate for their approval and terrified of their opposition. Here's where it gets insane. The real power in Imperial China wasn't held by either of the legitimate martial traditions. It was wielded by the forbidden cults, the revolutionary death societies that emperors labeled demonic because they possessed the only force capable of actually destroying imperial authority. The fanatical loyalty of desperate peasants who believed the world was ending. Picture the systematic terror. The White Lotus Society, the 8 Trigrams, the Red Turban Rebels, secret organizations that could mobilize hundreds of thousands of followers who were willing to die for the promise of a new cosmic order that would sweep away imperial corruption. Imagine the psychological warfare. Cult members who believed that death in battle would guarantee eternal paradise, that their leaders possessed supernatural powers, and that the current dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and deserved destruction. But here's what's truly terrifying about these demonic cults. They weren't random peasant uprisings. They were systematic revolutionary organizations with sophisticated recruitment networks, military training programs, and ideological frameworks that could sustain multi-generational campaigns against imperial authority. Archaeological evidence reveals cult training sites with weapons caches, ritual chambers for blood oath ceremonies, and communication networks that spanned entire provinces. Proof that these were military organizations disguised as religious movements. The real genius was in the fusion of martial and mystical power. Cult fighters combined practical combat techniques with ritual practices that convinced them they were invulnerable to imperial weapons and blessed by cosmic forces. Chinese military records describe battles where cult warriors would charge imperial cavalry while chanting prayers, convinced that their faith would protect them from bullets and blades, creating psychological terror among government forces who faced enemies that seemed immune to normal military tactics. But here's where it gets truly shocking. The cults were often led by former Shaolin monks who had been radicalized by imperial persecution. The destruction of Shaolin Temple by the Qing dynasty created a generation of warrior monks who joined revolutionary organizations and taught them advanced martial techniques. According to triad tradition, the Hung Mun, the legendary organization that would later evolve into the modern triads, traces its origins to surviving Shaolin monks who swore blood oaths to overthrow the Qing, restore the Ming. Whether historical fact or revolutionary myth, this story became weaponized nostalgia, a fusion of martial discipline and ideological fury that turned rebellion into sacred duty. The sound was like revolution itself, the terrifying chant of thousands of voices united in the belief that the current world order was corrupt and that only total destruction could create the conditions for cosmic renewal. Their martial arts weren't designed for tournaments or spiritual development. They were designed for assassination, insurrection, and the systematic destruction of imperial infrastructure by fighters who viewed death as victory and martyrdom as the highest achievement. But here's the ultimate truth that most people never understand. None of these three forces actually ruled Imperial China. Instead, they created a triangle of mutual dependence, where the emperor's survival depended on maintaining balance between forces that could destroy him if they ever united against imperial authority. Picture the systematic paranoia. Emperors who used Shaolin monks to suppress cult rebellions, Wudang masters to legitimize their authority, and imperial armies to prevent either religious tradition from becoming too powerful. Imagine the delicate balance. Shaolin provided military muscle, but could become a threat if they developed independent political ambitions. Wudang supplied spiritual legitimacy, but could withdraw support if the emperor violated cosmic principles. The cults represented popular discontent that could explode into revolution if imperial governance failed. But here's where it gets insane. The three forces weren't just competing with each other. They were systematically infiltrating each other. Cult members who learned Shaolin techniques, Wudang masters who advised cult leaders, and Shaolin monks who joined revolutionary organizations when imperial support disappeared. Archaeological evidence reveals training sites where multiple martial traditions were practiced simultaneously. Proof that the boundaries between orthodox and heterodox martial arts were more fluid than official histories suggest. The real genius of imperial survival was in playing the triangle against itself. Emperors who could convince Shaolin that Wudang was becoming too influential, or persuade Wudang masters that cult activities threatened cosmic harmony, or use both orthodox traditions to justify suppressing revolutionary movements. Chinese historical records describe the imperial court as the center of a three-way war. Recognition that the emperor's primary job wasn't governing the empire, but managing the competing forces that could either support or destroy imperial authority. But here's what's truly terrifying about this system. It was inherently unstable. Any emperor who lost the support of 2 out of 3 forces would face certain destruction, while any force that gained the alliance of the other 2 could overthrow the dynasty. The White Lotus Rebellion demonstrated this principle perfectly. When cult organizations gained support from displaced Shaolin monks and operated in regions where Wudang influence was weak, they nearly destroyed the Qing dynasty and drained the imperial treasury so completely that the empire never fully recovered. The sound was like a 3-way chess game played with armies. The constant maneuvering of forces that understood their survival depended on preventing any single player from achieving decisive advantage. The ultimate irony is that the emperor's power was always conditional, always temporary, and always dependent on forces that had their own agendas and could withdraw support whenever imperial policy conflicted with their institutional interests. So who really ruled Imperial China? The answer is both simple and terrifying. No one ruled completely, and everyone ruled partially. The emperor held the throne, but Shaolin controlled the military muscle that kept him there. Wudang provided the spiritual legitimacy that made his rule seem divinely ordained. And the demonic cults represented the revolutionary potential that could sweep away the entire system if imperial governance failed to meet popular needs. This wasn't just political complexity. It was systematic interdependence that created the most stable and longest-lasting governmental system in human history. Precisely because no single force could dominate completely, the Chinese approach proved that true power doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from understanding that survival requires managing forces that are too dangerous to destroy and too valuable to ignore. So the next time you hear about martial arts traditions or imperial dynasties, remember that you're looking at the remnants of a three-way war that lasted 2 millennia and created the template for how civilizations can survive by balancing competing forces that would otherwise tear them apart. The triangle of power never disappeared. It just learned to hide better.